Welcome to episode 2 of the Project Liberal podcast. My name's Josh Eckel. I'm the co-founder of Project Liberal, here joined as usual by my co-host, Jonathan Casey. Good morning.
Hello. Good morning.
And today we have a really awesome guest representing an awesome organization. And we're going to talk about a very important and relevant issue. As many people know, the Canadian wildfires have been in the news for the last 2 months. We've got, at least many places in the north and the northeast, seeing wildfire smoke coming over the border. Climate change is a top of mind for a lot of people in the context of this. And as many people know, many voices on the left are calling for an increased, larger government, more spending, calling for degrowth, blaming capitalism for these climate problems. And we don't think that at Project Liberal that is the only voice that needs to be represented in the discussion. So we're really excited to have Chris Barnard on the show, who represents an organization called the American Conservation Coalition. So Christopher is the Vice President of External Affairs at the American Conservation Coalition and the incoming president as of late August. He received a master's degree in international relations from the London School of Economics and currently resides in the beautiful swamp of Washington, D.C. Christopher, thank you for making time to talk to us this morning.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so I wanted to, before we go into any of the questions in the conversation about limited government and market-based solutions to climate change, I just wanted to see if maybe you could give us the spiel about the American Conservation Coalition, what you guys are doing, and why you got started.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, thank you for having me. Really happy to be here. And really, kind of like you mentioned, environmental and climate issues for a long time have been really dominated by the left. They've been very one-sided. And ACC was founded in 2017 to step into that space and to bring conservatives to the table on these issues. And obviously, the principles that underpin our approach to climate issues are economic growth, markets, innovation, all the things that conservatives like, but also classical liberals and libertarians. And so it's very much kind of providing a new way of looking at these issues. And pushing back against some of the big government Green New Deal-esque approaches that have dominated this debate for so long. We have about 20,000 young people across the country, growing very rapidly. And really, we're the only ones doing this on our side of the aisle. And it's incredibly important because it is the number one issue for most people in our generation. And if we don't give them an alternative to the Green New Deal, then we'll end up with the Green New Deal.
That is a very powerful mission. I am extremely happy that you guys decided to do this. I think it's much needed. So I was going to just jump into some of the questions to talk about, and basically the whole goal in my mind of this show is going to be to explore what market-based and limited government solutions to climate change look like. Because a lot of people talk about that, but then when you get into the tactics, what actually does that look like? So first and foremost, I just wanted to ask the big question, the elephant in the room question, which a lot of people get asked on the right when we talk about climate change, is do you believe, or at least maybe ACC generally believe, that man-made climate change is a real phenomenon? And if so, why or why not?
Yeah, I mean, it's really frustrating because there should just be a one-word answer to this to anyone that is asked of it is yes. Obviously, it's real. The last 8 years have been the hottest recorded years in history. The science is really quite clear on the fact that global warming is happening and that we need to do something about it. The one thing I will say is that the science is also clear about the fact that the climate alarmists are also wrong. And it's an interesting position because you have a lot of people on the left that say we have 12 years left to tackle climate change, or billions of people are going to die. And that's just very extremist rhetoric that A, doesn't reflect the science, but B, also, it doesn't inspire people to actually do something about it. It actually inspires fear and pessimism rather than hope and optimism.
Yeah.
But conversely, people that say that there's no issue whatsoever are clearly not watching the news, first of all, but also they're also misrepresenting the science. And so at the very basic level, climate change is real. Man is the primary cause of it. There are many causes. Climate has always changed, but we are accelerating climate change. And we need to do something about it because it is a serious problem, but it is not the end of the world. And the solutions that we approach and the rhetoric that we use for this should reflect that.
I think you hit on a really good point that a lot of people really dismiss climate change because of the solutions are so out there and would have such harmful effects. All the solutions in the public discourse really are more government control, more government involvement in little things, or even outright depopulation or degrowth, which would have really horrible effects, not only just on every individual's well-being, but on our planet as a whole. Like,
it might even accelerate climate change, anecdotally. Right? In many cases,
when government controls the means of production, we know what the results are of that, and that's more pollution and more damage to the environment.
Yep.
So how do you, when you're talking to people who say climate change isn't real, it's all a leftist plot, how do you talk to somebody who's like that? I know my parents very much in that boat of, well, it's all fake, it's all just fake news. How do you talk to them?
Yeah, I'll say two things to that. The first is it's really important that the voices that do talk about this don't unnecessarily politicize it. I think we've seen that from some folks within the scientific community, unfortunately, where it's kind of become like their politics have intertwined with their kind of scientific approach. That being said, ACC produced a documentary, I think it was about 18 months ago, with the Daily Caller, actually, where we went around the country and interviewed self-professed conservative climate scientists. And these are people like Kerry Emanuel at MIT or Barry Bickmore at BYU in Utah. And these are people that have studied the science, have come to the conclusion that it is not fake news, that it is not a Chinese hoax, and that we need to do something about it. But that doesn't mean abandoning their political principles or their worldview. And I think if we can get those kinds of people, and the reason that we produce that documentary, if we can get them in front of conservative audiences that might be skeptical of kind of the mainstream science, and they're hearing it from people who are quote unquote on their side, I think that's incredibly helpful. And so encourage people to check that out. You can just go to YouTube and put Daily Caller climate change documentary. The second thing I'll say is, for one of my biggest frustrations with the way that people talk about climate change, especially on the left, is the abstract manner in which they approach this. They're talking about parts per million, about net zero by 2050, about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And most people have no direct connection to any of those terms. It's invisible. You don't have like a personal understanding of what a carbon dioxide looks like. So we need to start connecting this issue to the way it impacts your life. And so if you are a farmer in a rural district and you're seeing how erratic weather patterns are impacting your crop yield, you can kind of bring that back to how climate is impacting that. If you're in Wisconsin, like Benji Backer, our founder, he grew up there, and he's like, I can't remember the last time I had a white Christmas. And a lot of people across the country like notice that. And you can be like, well, why? Because climate change is impacting like seasons and snow and all that kind of stuff. Similarly, if you're talking to people in Florida, pretty much a red state nowadays, sea level rise, they notice that. And so that you just got to be able to connect it to the issues that actually matter to people, rather than talking about these like really vague, abstract ideas.
That makes a lot of sense. It seems like a more effective strategy to at least win over hearts and minds. One of the things that we talked about in the first episode of our show, we had an epidemiologist, Jacob Rich, on, and we talked about the politicization of vaccines, and it was almost a similar kind of a conversation. It was like, as soon as politics starts getting into the conversation, we're not talking about results, or we're not actually talking about how it affects you. We're talking about red versus blue. And the last thing you want to do is politicize an issue as existential as vaccines or climate change in a way, because again, it can be an existential crisis if it goes unaddressed for the next several decades. So that's interesting, Chris.
Politics is always the one size fits all solution, right? And to some degree, we do have things in this world that do need a one size fits all solution, right? Don't kill each other. But for vaccines, for climate change, there are many solutions to these, and that's kind of where I'd love to see this go from here.
Okay, so why don't we talk about solutions, Chris, if that's cool with you? So just where you guys are on your mind, like what can be done tactically on a macro scale. So one of the questions that I have is, first of all, we know at least global spending right now, I think, of fossil fuels is like $5.9 trillion. So, that's an estimate that says that governments across the world spend almost $6 trillion subsidizing fossil fuels. So I'm sure a lot of people would agree that we should probably work to end those subsidies at the very minimum. But one of the questions that comes in is renewable energy, and whether government subsidies are needed for renewable energy to compete with fossil fuels, and just kind of how renewable energy, we can talk about nuclear, but I'm thinking more like wind and solar, how those kind of fit into the picture. to drive a transition in the market. I mean, do you have any commentary on that just broadly?
I mean, the first thing I'll say, and I appreciate you mentioning nuclear in there as well.
Yeah.
When we talk about the energy sources that are going to help us tackle climate change, we talk about clean energy. I think there's a little bit of an ideological, tribal approach that a lot of people take when they just talk about renewables, and they try to talk about like 100% renewables future while excluding things like carbon capture and storage and hydrogen and nuclear and all that kind of stuff. And so that's just a general point. But to the specific question about renewables like wind and solar, I think it's really quite remarkable to see how the market is actually heading in the direction of just renewables. You see that in, like, for example, last year in the United States, like 80% of private investment in energy sources went to renewable and clean energy sources. Like, we're getting to a point where the market is actually embracing renewables, where the costs have come down to such an extent, partly because of subsidies, but also a lot because of innovation, and they're becoming cost competitive in a lot of areas. I think the concern that I have when it comes to kind of a renewables only future, so 100% renewables, is that you do a disservice to renewables themselves, because right now, like, the wind only blows when the wind blows, and so you can only get energy that way. And similarly with solar panels, and we see that when the wind stops blowing or the sun stops shining, it's very expensive to have a backup. And right now, often we go to fossil fuel backups. Yeah. But if you have nuclear plants as well that are base load, that are clean energy, then you actually can kind of help balance the grid to the extent that renewables maintain their cost competitiveness. And so I think we are in a position where more and more renewables are kind of just being driven by the market rather than by subsidies. And then a really cool example of that actually is Texas. Texas, if it were a country, would be the 5th largest producer of wind energy in the world. As you know, Texas has a deregulated competitive electricity market. Yep. And data shows that Texas is decarbonizing faster on a per unit of GDP rate than California. Why? Because competition and innovation drives this kind of stuff, and they have much lower electricity prices. And so we're really kind of taking this market-based approach to energy policy is really important, both from a kind of clean energy perspective, but also from a cost perspective.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And there was a study I saw. It said that if you have an actual competitive and free market, like a free energy market, a real competitive market, the price, you see decarbonization at like 66%, and price drops up to almost 50%. So you're seeing like a massive improvement in not only clean energy, but also cost for the consumer. It seems like a win-win for everybody. Even if fossil fuels may be part of the mix, the overall, it's moving in the right direction.
Right.
One of the things you mentioned about nuclear, I actually wanted to talk about nuclear broadly, because this is one of those things where we consider ourselves like what true liberals or classical liberals, and that kind of falls in a little bit more on the libertarian leaning tradition than maybe the conservative tradition. One of the things that we hear in our circles all the time is nuclear power requires too much government intervention. Like, it requires a lot of subsidies or government involvement. And, I think there's trade-offs. So as liberals, we're not reflexively against any government action by any means, like you might find with like an ANCAP or something like that. But I'm curious as to how you feel like we could have, say, a limited government solution to nuclear. Are there any dynamics or states or countries that have like deregulated nuclear or approached that conversation in a way that doesn't require a lot of government action or government investment?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would actually encourage people to check out what Matt Ridley, the British scientist and Lord, has written about this stuff. But essentially what happened in kind of the 60s and 70s, when we were truly entering the atomic age in the US, and we realized kind of the abundant, clean, affordable energy that nuclear provided. And so we were building nuclear plants left, right, and center across the country, like literally building dozens of them. And that's when the environmental movement stepped in and became very skeptical of nuclear plants. There's some shady ties there to the fossil fuel industry in terms of like funding and all that kind of stuff for these environmental groups. But the real crux of it is that they started going to politicians and saying like nuclear is dangerous. Obviously, like Chernobyl didn't help, and then later
Right.
on Fukushima and 3 Mile Island. But they use these fear tactics to get politicians to essentially regulate nuclear out of existence. And if you look at people like Bill McKibben and others and things that they've said about this, like that was quite explicitly their strategy. Like they wanted to make nuclear non-competitive with other energy sources, in their mind, obviously ideally renewables, by getting the government to stack the deck against nuclear. And so what we ended up with was something called a Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is the federal body in charge of regulating nuclear power, that has this absolutely labyrinthine like maze of red tape for nuclear plants. In fact, in the last 3 decades, we've only built one new nuclear plant because of it. They don't even have currently a regulatory process for next generation nuclear plants to be approved and built. It's just a complete mess. And what we can actually do in a limited government way is to assess these regulations, see which ones are necessary for actual public health reasons, and which ones don't reflect the science and are actually politically motivated, and change the regulatory process for building nuclear plants. And you can actually do it in a way where instead of it taking 15 years and billions of dollars over budget to build a nuclear plant, you can do what, for example, the UAE has done, which is building like 4 or 5 nuclear plants in the last 6 or 7 years. Like it is possible, but you need to create a regulatory environment, and the government needs to get out of the way to allow that innovation and construction to happen.
Makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. Jonathan, you want to take the next one?
Yeah, I kind of want to touch. I was going to make a quick point about kind of nuclear power. You wonder how much the industry could have advanced had government gotten out of the way 20, 30 years ago. Because right now we're hearing about thorium reactors. We're hearing about these new technologies in the nuclear space. We can recycle nuclear waste now. There's all these different things that we could have been doing that could have been advanced and moving along that would have made nuclear to where you can't. It's impossible to have a meltdown. There's all of these technologies. There's all of these that the market would have invested in this technology a lot more money, a lot more time, a lot more effort had government gotten out of the way 20, 30 years ago and allowed these technologies to be developed. The money is going to always follow where the profit is, right? And if we had made it profitable for nuclear power to be invested in, we would have seen a massive leap forward. And I think that we would have had a far easier time in getting and in building public trust in nuclear power, because that's another aspect of nuclear power that really, we didn't really touch on yet, is that a lot of people are scared of nuclear power. They're afraid of a meltdown. They're afraid of the nuclear waste. But when you actually look at things, one, you can recycle nuclear waste. Two, nuclear waste is actually quite, it's not something you want to stand next to, but you can put it in a container and it can stay in that container for 500 years and it's fine. You're going to be okay. It can be dealt with. And then also coal puts out more radioactive waste than nuclear power plants do. And that's something that I think most people don't understand is you have to ask the question, okay, when you get rid of nuclear power, what are you going to replace it with? And guess what? All of the alternatives are worse. Right. From an environmental perspective, from a health perspective, from basically any perspective you look at it, all the alternatives to nuclear power, especially, unless you're going with wind or solar, they're always going to have really negative effects.
Right. And I mean, if you live in a place like Colorado, the background radiation from the mountains there is higher than you'll find at any nuclear plant. And so people that are literally just living in Colorado are exposed to more radioactivity than workers at a nuclear plant.
That's a hell of an anecdote right there. I tell you what.
And the really frustrating thing, like to your question about how governments are actually often the obstacle to building out nuclear power and have been, is you see, like, for example, that the New York State shut down the nuclear plant that was outside New York City that supplied a quarter of the city's electricity, obviously all clean. And they closed that for very political reasons. And overnight, emissions shot up by like 30% in the state. Because
like what just happened in Germany.
Right. Similarly in Germany, like you're shutting down nuclear plants, you replace that with fossil fuels because we don't have enough wind and solar yet to be able to do that. And so it's just a really frustrating situation because we genuinely could have like like France, basically an entirely decarbonized electricity grid because of nuclear. And it was a political choice not to do that. And we are kind of, feeling
we're facing the repercussions decades later and digging ourselves out of a hole. That's significant to think about.
What do you view? What's your opinion on like carbon tax or cap and trade? What's your view on those ways to control pollution? Are those good, bad? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a tricky situation because you have to be able to differentiate between kind of the elegance of an economic solution and the reality of politics. And I think like there's economically a lot to be said for some kind of like cap and trade or carbon tax system. But that only exists really kind of within an abstract, perfect economic world. And we just see that the politics are completely not there for carbon tax or for a cap and trade system. And honestly, often I don't really trust the government to be able to design it in a way that actually would be effective. Like if you look at the European Union's cap and trade system, they had all kinds of exemptions for their preferred industries. And so obviously that completely failed. And even if you look at the Waxman-Markey legislation, which would have been like a cap and trade bill that Obama had been pushing at the beginning of his presidency, we actually see that the emissions reductions that we've achieved since 2009 are higher than Waxman-Markey tried to achieve in a policy that didn't pass, right? And so it's just like a bizarre world where I understand carbon tax advocates and I understand kind of their adherence to this economic elegance, but I think we need to just be realistic about what solutions work and which ones are politically feasible and focus on those. Because if you want to be like a Green New Deal advocate and Green New Deal or bust, similarly like carbon tax or bust, then you're not going to find any solutions that actually work somewhere in the middle. So it's just, that's kind of my take on the carbon tax stuff.
Oh, that's actually very interesting because again, you're saying that the proposed government solution, even the optimistic and rosy projections of what that was like 10, 15 years ago now, were achieved via market factors without the government passing the bill. So that actually leads me to my next question, which is related to urgency. There's all this urgency, and you kind of touched on this at the beginning, that maybe it's not as big of a crisis as a lot of people on the left want to think. I mean, everyone's saying like if the world's going to end in 4 years, and then 4 years passes, and then they have to delete the old tweets and post it again, right? You've seen that. But a lot of people, and I think this is a legitimate criticism, because a lot of people don't have the same faith in the market that say maybe people on the right might, or people that understand what market factors do. They say that the free market approach, or you say a market-based approach, lacks the urgency that we need, and it's going to take too long. Right. Do you feel that? Like, what is your thoughts? How do you address that concern?
So I think they point to a truth, which is that we are not going fast enough. Mm-hmm. Now, what they fail to recognize is that, for example, right now in the US, the single biggest obstacle to building out clean energy infrastructure and tackling climate change is the government red tape that is not allowing us to build anything. And so like we have these conversations about so-called permitting reform. Like on average, it takes nearly 6 years just to permit a clean energy project, or an energy project in general. Yep. Costs like $5 million on average in terms of like compliance costs and lawyers and all that kind of stuff. And like, if you're talking about a timeline of like trying to tackle climate change within the next 12 years, then how are we having government regulation make it take 6 years, sometimes 10, sometimes 15 years to build the very infrastructure that we need?
Right.
And so I understand kind of the frustration that we're not moving fast enough, and people tend to put that like at the market's feet. But I think a lot of it has to do with the way that the government is set us up for failure with the red tape that they've put into place, often at the request of environmentalists. And it's just very frustrating because when you look at like the Waxman-Markey example, that was a really good example of how the market actually went faster than the proposed government policy that failed. And that's because the market determined that natural gas was better than coal, and in the process, like, is reducing emissions faster than any other country. And so I think we need to look at policies that unleash more of that, rather than leaning more into the government stuff that is proven to not really actually work out.
there's talk about degrowth, and we have to our consumption needs to go way down for us to fix the problem. But when we look at a lot of these countries, we've seen that they still have their growth, but their carbon emissions are going down in a lot of Western countries. Why is that? Can you kind of explain the mechanism on what's going on there?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's speaking of elegant economic like models and graphs, there's a really cool concept out there called the environmental Kuznets curve. And it's basically, it goes like this, and it shows that as an economy grows, initially, obviously, environmental degradation also goes up, whether that's pollution, emissions, plastic use, whatever it is, it goes up. But then you reach a level of prosperity in an economy where actually the more you continue growing the economy, the more the pollution or environmental degradation goes down. Now, there's a few reasons why that happens. One is just kind of very simply psychologically, if you are a developing economy and you are still a mother that's worried about putting a meal on your table for your kids at night or a roof over your head, then your primary concern is surviving, not like clean energy or protecting the environment. You're just going to take that survival at all costs. And that's kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? But if you get to a point where you are like a medium or a high income country, and all of a sudden you don't have to worry about where your next meal is coming from, and you start having disposable income to think about other things, then you start thinking about, oh, I like this stove that I'm using is producing a lot of pollution inside, and it's bad for me and my kids. And so maybe I should consider upgrading or getting something else. Or you like want to take your kids out to a national park and visit that, and you are willing to spend money on the conservation projects happening there. And so there just comes a point where the concern for environmental issues in an economy starts trumping the concern for basic survival. And then you have more resources flowing to that. You have nonprofit groups that get started. You have community groups that build community gardens or a park or an organic farm or whatever it might be. You just start having that because of the basic fact that people are no longer concerned with survival. They're concerned with other things that are higher on kind of the hierarchy of needs. Mm-hmm. The second reason
makes a lot of sense. Sorry.
Yeah. And the second reason is when an economy grows, you have more resources that go to innovation. We know that capitalism rewards efficiency. If you can build a product with fewer material inputs, that's going to save you money. And so you have an incentive within capitalism to do that. And innovation that happens, whether it's kind of wind and solar or like your iPhone, which if you think about it, like I have my phone right here, this is a calculator and a camera and a notepad and a computer and a GPS and an alarm clock and everything in one little tiny box. And if you think of all the resources that you were required to build all those individual things, that's a lot. If you can do it in one little product like this, then you're saving a lot of resources. And so ultimately, capitalism incentivizes efficiency, and innovation allows you to have continually more efficient and cleaner products with a lower environmental footprint. And so we see that, for example, with going from coal to natural gas. Yeah, like natural gas is cleaner. It's better for public health. It burns more easily. It's easier to transport. All these factors happened because we were at a point where we could do hydraulic fracking, and we had the technology and the innovation to be able to do that. And sorry, it's kind of like a long explanation here, but at the end of the day, the environmental Kuznets curve allows an economy to grow. And then once it reaches that point, it has the innovation and the ability to start using fewer and fewer resources for continued economic growth. And that is the story that no one is talking about when it comes to climate and environmental issues.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. It's almost like you take Maslow's hierarchies of needs, just paste it on a society, and it actually explains a lot of these dynamics when you think about it. So it's an interesting analogy to make. One of the things that, if I'm going to play devil's advocate, at least on some of that argument, this is something I hear a lot, and I personally have not created a compelling narrative myself on how to address it. So I'm curious as to whether or not you have thought about this issue. A lot of people say that, okay, the US and Western countries are decarbonizing while growing. But mainly that's due to the fact that we're exporting our manufacturing and a lot of our, say, dirtier industries to other countries like China and India or whatever. And you see that. I mean, that's a challenge I think that we all are very aware of. Like, yeah, sure, the United States might be moving in the right place from a decarbonization perspective, but then when you look at countries like China, I mean, they're still increasing those emissions. Do you have a thought on that narrative, like how you address that narrative, or whether do you think if we give China enough time, they'll be decarbonizing as well? I mean, I assume that's kind of the idea here, but do you have any thoughts on it?
So 3 main points. The first one I would say is that if you look at a fair few countries in the West that are decarbonizing while still growing their economy, you actually look at their manufacturing output in real terms has also gone up. Okay. And so like there's some element of obviously offshoring emissions that always happens, but it's not like we've like completely gotten rid of any industry that would be responsible for our emissions, and that's the only reason that we're decarbonizing. And there's a lot of data that shows that like our own like industrial capacities and manufacturing facilities and all that are also getting cleaner and better. So that's like just one initial point. The second point is that I think it's just we need to be careful about pitting economic growth versus environmental protection or climate progress. I think a lot of times it's kind of like a neo-colonial mindset where it's like, oh, climate change is so important that we can't let African countries or Asian countries use coal because we need to tackle climate change. But we used coal when we were developing and industrializing. We got rich because we were using fossil fuels. Why would we rob all these poor people in other parts of the world that haven't been on that same trajectory yet from that opportunity to reach a standard of living that we have? And so it's just important that we frame it not as like it's one or the other, but that we can do both. And the third thing I mention is really the way the benefit of we don't have to wait another 150 years till all these other countries are industrialized and then start like going down on the environmental Kuznets curve is because a lot of countries in the West have gotten to the point where they built these innovations and they built these products that can then be used elsewhere. And you have that blueprint for doing that. So like China or India or Africa are not starting from square one. Like they can benefit from the innovation that we've come up with, and we can share that with them, export that to them. And I think the only way that we can really do that is by creating a globally competitive marketplace for these things. And what I mean by that is if you want to have China or India decarbonize, you're not going to do that by like going to a UN climate conference every year and like wagging your finger at them and telling them like you have to choose between economic growth and climate progress. You do that by creating the economic conditions where actually building that nuclear plant or building that solar farm is better than opening that coal plant and makes more economic sense. And you do see some of that. You have China is the largest producer of solar panels, of wind turbines. They're building the most nuclear plants in the world. They dominate EV supply chains. There's a reason why they're doing that. It's because they see that that's the future and they want to be kind of the Saudi Arabia of the clean energy future. Yeah. And I think America and the West need to create a regulatory structure and an economic structure where we can actually do that as well, and where we can start investing in a lot more of these technologies and allowing the market to do what it does best, is to accelerate innovation so that we can then export that and bring that to India and China and other countries. And I think that's really the only way that you globally address climate change is by, like, I call it a clean energy arms race. You want them to feel super personally bought in on this future and for the economics to make sense, because if the economics don't make sense, it's never going to happen.
Makes sense.
Think about if we had reduced nuclear, the cost of nuclear power by 20, 30, 40%. Imagine what that would do to a developing nation. Imagine how much easier it would be for them to just plug that technology in their market and go.
Well, I mean, it's the same concept too. They're skipping. We in the United States had to build wires for phone lines for a long time. In countries in Africa, they're skipping straight to wireless. It's the same concept with being able to skip straight to renewables rather than having to go through all that learning that the West did in the 1800s and 1900s. Sorry to cut you off, Jonathan.
Exactly. So we've talked about, the left likes to say there's in this many years, there's going to be a red line that if we cross, we're done. We can't cross this line. And obviously that line keeps changing and moving. But is there a line? Is there a line in the future? Can you give us, do you have a sense of where that line could possibly be? What's your thoughts on that, on that whole discussion?
Yeah. I mean, so it's you're dealing with science and very complex ecological like issues, and so it's not like there's like a specific date at some point in the future where we have to like have this figured out by. I do think like there's a general goal within the scientific community that reflects the best available science, which is that generally we should be net zero by around 2050. If that's 2051 or 2052 versus 2048, like obviously there's like wiggle room there. So that's kind of, there's like a ballpark that we should be aiming for based on like modeling and data and whatnot. But I think that the left tries to co-opt those dates and frankly often influence and change them to pursue like a particular political agenda. So you had like the Greens and Labour in the UK, or you had like the AOCs in the US. They're like, actually, no, we want to be 100% clean by 2030 or 20, like, and it just becomes a political game where you're constantly moving the goalposts because that benefits your like particular political point of view. And so that's why we tend not to really engage in the targets game, because you're always going to be outcompeted by someone who has a more ambitious target, because they can just say it, right? Like there's no cost to them saying we're going to do it by 2030, because that's politics, that's rhetoric. And so we prefer to just look at the solutions, look at the ways that we can actually get to these outcomes. And the outcome is tackling climate change, having a clean energy future that is also abundant and affordable. Like that's an outcome that is much more inspiring to people and like much more tangible than just saying net zero by X date.
Got it. I also think that if there's a danger of investing in the wrong technology, right? In a few years, there may be a new technology that comes out and goes, okay, this is a better, far faster, more efficient system. So we have to be careful about not just throwing all our eggs into solar or into wind. We have to make sure that we have diversity in our development in our energy system, because we don't know what's on the horizon. We don't know what's going to be invented in the next 5, 10, 15 years.
Right. Scaling up nuclear power, or, major breakthroughs in the nuclear power game. We could beat AOC's expectations if we just let the market work, much before.
Right. If there's one thing we can learn from history, is that markets are going to make far better long-term decisions than government.
Right.
Okay. Chris.
The last thing I'll say on that is, I do think very much that allowing kind of having this all of the above approach and allowing for competition and for the market to do what it does best is really important. I do think there are particular instances where the government does have a role in helping kickstart some of the like research, like basic scientific research and innovation that needs to happen for things that are like not reflected by the market yet. So like one example is fusion energy. Like fusion right now, there's like no clear market demand for it because it's still like however many years away. And you do still see a lot of private sector investment in it, actually like a ton, which is very impressive, because they realize that if they crack this, they've like won the game essentially.
Right.
But there is still like an element of like basic research, whether it's like fusion or nuclear energy back in the like 40s and 50s, that the government can help when it's like pre-market. But then the point is that once it becomes something that is competitive and commercial, then we should take a step back and allow it to compete and not pick those winners and losers.
Yep. Love that message. Absolutely buy into that. And so we're kind of coming towards the end of the show here. And I wanted to maybe give some of our audience some specific stories to look up or anecdotes. One of the questions that I had on my list was, we talked about nuclear, we talked about deregulation generally, but do you have any stories or policies that have showed to work, or say, different types of solutions that have been presented that you've seen work? Like if we're talking about tactics, like tactically, what do you think people in our audience should advocate for locally or look for projects to support? I mean, do any things pop up in your mind there?
I'd say there's two. One which was government led through policy, and one which is just kind of like a general organic bottom up story. I'll start with the latter one. Most people, like, you'll probably know Eleanor Ostrom. She was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize in economics, and she was thinking a lot about the tragedy of the commons and how do we kind of solve that problem of everyone using resources at the same time and just depleting it, and there's no incentive for them to really take care of that. And often, like, we're presented with like, okay, well then the government will come in and regulate and like apportion resources and say you can do this or you can do that. And often that's not very effective because the government has its own incentives, and so they will give it to whoever they're friends with or whatever their particular political incentive is at that moment. And B, they often lack the local knowledge. And so Eleanor Ostrom, what she did was she went to communities around the world to see how they were dealing with these kinds of problems. And she actually found that in the absence of government policy, local communities tend to come up with solutions that are really innovative, that actually are voluntary and just come from the bottom up. And so, like, a really good example that she would often bring up is in Switzerland, you had this problem with grazing, where you had just like these alpine fields, and like different farmers and ranchers would have their cattle go and graze. And they realized that if all the cattle were grazing all the time, then quickly the land is depleted, and that benefits no one, right? Because at the end of the day, like, even if it's for free or whatever, if 3 years from now that field is completely depleted and you can't have your cattle graze on it anymore, that's bad for you. And so they came up with an agreement where they had kind of like a rotational grazing schedule that the ranchers agreed upon themselves without any like enforcement mechanism from the government, but at the community level, where they would have like different farmers would have different like cattle on different days grazing different parts of the field, and they would rotate it in a way where the field would then have time to heal and recover while the cattle are somewhere else. And this just happened completely organically. And there's tons of stories like that in Switzerland, in Turkey with fishing stocks, with like all over the world. You find communities coming up with really cool solutions where they self-enforce through social pressure and through like the right incentives in the absence of government. So that's a really cool story on that. One like instance of where government policy actually was really successful is in Iceland, where they had a big problem that they noticed with overfishing, and fishing stocks were being depleted. And they were trying to find a solution to this. At one point, they said, okay, we're going to regulate what days people fish on. And so the fishers would just, instead of being on the water for, say, 8 hours, they would be on the water for 12 hours to make up for the days that they couldn't fish. And so they just like kept like going around the regulations and these rules that the government was creating that weren't working. Until an economist who's actually like a free market economist came up with the idea of so-called individual tradable quotas. And so they kind of took a scientific approach to what the fishing stocks were, what was a sustainable catch each year, and then they had individual quotas for fishermen to be like, okay, you're allowed to fish this many fish this year, but you can trade it. And so if for some reason you think that each fish is worth $1 and you think that each fish is worth $2, you can pay the other fisher to take some of their quota, and you kind of have this like law of supply and demand and the market working it out themselves. And they saw like huge rebound of fishing populations, which actually helped in the long run because it allowed them to increase the quotas to stay within the sustainability. And so it worked out economically, it worked out environmentally, and it kept the fishers happy. So I think that's just like a really cool of government policy that actually understood how incentives work and how to use the market for a good environmental outcome.
Right. Well, it creates the incentive of private property, right? They own that quota. They own that piece of not land, but actual a piece of property, and gives them a personal interest in it. And so that, I think, is where that, we see that in life. If public property, the tragedy of the commons, it happens in just about every aspect. We don't take care of it as well as we take care of our own property.
Yeah.
having a stake in the game is very important. Okay. Before I close this out, Jonathan, do you have any other questions you wanted to ask?
No, thank you, Chris, for coming on.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, Chris. Thank you for not only taking time to talk to us today, but also the work that you guys do with ACC. I think it's extremely important work. And it's, as somebody who's also a fellow millennial, it's amazing to see an organization, millennial run, focused on trying to convince all the boomers on the right to buy into these values, or at least understand that this is an issue. So I don't know if you have anything you want to plug, but give you the floor.
I was going to say, I think I'm technically Gen Z. So
there you go.
Oh, my.
Even more so.
Even better. Yeah, even better.
Yeah. I think if people want to learn more, there's a few ways for them to do that. One is we created a Market Environmentalism Academy, which is, I think it's marketacademy.eco, where people can, like, for free take courses on everything from the role of hunters and fishers in conservation to nuclear energy to carbon capture and storage. Like, there's just so many different topics there with, like, cool videos and readings and quizzes and that kind of stuff. So people can check that out if they want to learn more about specific topics. And we have like 20 courses. And then the second thing is we have a kind of climate framework that we call the Climate Commitment. And you can go to theclimatecommitment.com, which is 6 big ideas to tackle climate change with, like, specific policy ideas and everything underneath that. And very much rooted in innovation, markets, like energy, like abundance. And so if people want to learn more about kind of this approach to climate change and like want to support it, there's ways to do that. And so you can just head to theclimatecommitment.com.
Awesome. And website for ACC is acc.eco, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome stuff. Okay. Chris, thank you again for your time. Thank you, Jonathan, for joining us as well. We will see you guys on the next episode. But thank you for everything. Thanks for tuning in. Have a great day, everybody.